No song today. We're going back to classic style. Today's guest is Keith Kurlander, a psychotherapist, co-founder of the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, and host of the Higher Practice podcast. We talk about psychedelics as both healing tools and disruptors, as well as the interplay between trauma, mental health, and the nervous system. We also discuss listening to your inner purpose, your North Star, and how losing that connection can lead to suffering. This is my conversation with Keith Kurlander. Today we're going to discuss mental health and suffering and how that interplays with things like psychedelics, but much more. Let's start with you in your dorm room at age 19, your first psilocybin trip, because I think that's a good turning point where everything can branch out from.
Turning point that is both a nightmare and a and a revelation. I was 19. I was kind of philosophical young guy. I was into different philosophical things and psychology and also like having fun. And so I was trying psilocybin and not knowing what to expect, of course. And things took I went back to my dorm room at some point by myself, and things took a turn for the worse, and I got super overwhelmed, and then I started sort of recognizing this feeling that I've been in despair my whole life. And I've always felt this way, which I think was true on some level, and that the only resolution is to kill myself. And so I was on the 19th floor or something like that in a high-rise dorm room, walked over to the window and thought I was going to do it. And then I had this strong hallucination of my 5-year-old sister that started yelling at me not to do it. Not for me, but for her. And so I just broke down, clawed my way back over to my bed and just held on for dear life for a night. And then that kicked out. After that, I was in a very serious mental health journey. I was on and off for most of my adult life until maybe 5 to 10 years ago, where it really mostly resolved. So that's the story.
Yeah. And then you went to some psychiatrists after that, and what did they say? And then what was your heart telling yourself that whole time?
So this was 30 years ago. I underwent psychiatric treatment. I got some meds. I had different things. I had a lot of things being told to me. Some said I had an emerging psychotic disorder. One person said that. But I don't think that was actually true. The other person's like, oh, this is, a depressive thing. And then somebody else was more of like, you've got kind of a manic depressive thing going on. And, they just started throwing these labels at me. But they didn't really understand anything about what happened in the psychedelics. We didn't really talk about that much. There wasn't much books to go read. I mean, I didn't know to go find. I mean, sure, you had like Groff's book or something, but I didn't know to go find that kind of stuff. So I was sort of alone making sense of it for a long time.
And then you mentioned there was this deep, overwhelming experience when you were on the psilocybin at that time, but it sounds like it traces back to your childhood or before childhood. There's this ancestral generational stuff going on as well. So yeah, what is the interplay between trauma, whether it's complex PTSD or intergenerational stuff or whatever, and mental health challenges, suffering, whatever you want to call it?
I think the first answer to that question, we have to talk a little bit about what is trauma. Trauma has traditionally been defined as PTSD. And so it's been defined as a disorder based on a set of symptoms. And that disorder isn't that old. We're talking maybe, 20, 30 years. So what came out from that was really coming from war veterans and the strong symptoms that could come with war trauma and maybe acute event traumas. But that doesn't tell us anything about what the process of trauma is. It only just describes what a set of symptoms is. And the problem is that set of symptoms is narrow. PTSD is not the only way trauma manifests. It typically manifests in that way when you have acute episodic trauma events, but does not manifest typically that way with more long-term trauma and complex and things like that. So, what is trauma? Trauma is a process in the nervous system. Plain and simple. The nervous system in a regulated homeostatic state, it's got a brake, it's got a gas pedal. These things are working together to speed the car up, to slow the car down. The car's working efficiently. You're getting from A to B down the road. When trauma happens based on an event that was overwhelming and we couldn't process, the system is either too revved up, too slowed down, or both the brake and the gas pedals on at the same time, because we're operating as if that unresolved event is still happening. So we're operating as if we still need the car to be revved up or we need to be completely collapsed because there's a threat. So that's trauma. Trauma is basically the threat response system that's innate in many animals throughout the animal kingdom, obviously, all animals. Where you have a survival instinct and it kicks in to fight, flight, freeze. Trauma is when that system doesn't shut off, and that's called a traumatic process. So, to answer your question, how is it related to mental health conditions? 99 out of 100 conditions have many root causes, but they likely have a traumatic process happening underneath them. It's not the only thing that's going on, but that's one of the things I could probably comfortably say is the most common root cause of all conditions.
So, what was your nervous system like at that time, and perhaps before that as well?
It was a fucking mess. I mean, first of all, how many 19-year-olds' nervous systems are really stable and solid anyways? I mean, especially right now, I mean, that's a whole different topic. Not many. And that's just you look at the data on that. But no, I was a mess. I was agitated prior to the psilocybin experience. I was agitated. I was socially anxious. I was shut down. I was having dark thoughts. It wasn't in a good state. It was in a traumatic state. And there's a spectrum of a traumatized state. How traumatized is your nervous system and how healthy is it? That's a spectrum. We oscillate in that spectrum. I was on the very traumatized end.
Well, let's look at that spectrum. Maybe you can lay it out for us, and that will help give us a better understanding of what is mental health, what is mental illness. Are we all in this spectrum? Yeah, talk about that.
Well, mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar, and then we have other stuff we could talk about, but personality disorders. There's a lot of root causes that these symptoms develop from, right? So it's not just a traumatized nervous system. But I'll just go back to saying again, but likely there's a traumatized nervous system if you have these conditions, likely, as one of the things happening. So that's the relationship between mental health conditions. Now, in terms of like, well, what is it? What's the spectrum? I mean, I think there's a spectrum from the person who is pretty stable and relatively relaxed when there's not a threat response or when they're not needing to engage, adrenaline and things for activities, or and then they can engage it and then they can come back down. And that's one person. But I would say that probably most people have some level of a traumatized nervous system that they're processing. How much? I don't know. I mean, it could be everywhere through a serious, you have symptoms of a serious mental health condition as a result of it. Or it's just like, the fly in your face that kind of bugs you a little, right? I think it's a wide spectrum. But we're humans and we have events that we couldn't process that leave an imprint of memory in our brain that's triggering cue dependent learning, right? So we have cue dependent triggers where we're cues in the environment stimulate these responses in us. And if it's bad enough, it's always stimulated.
How does this map onto, or does it map onto, this spiritual or existential spectrum of where we lie and meaning in our life and living along with our values and I don't know, just feeling human? Yeah, this might be a kind of vague question, but what I like about your podcast is you don't look at mental health challenges just as like a biochemical body mind thing. There's something more going on.
Yeah. I like that conversation. I mean, I look at it on different levels, right? I look at it on sort of mind spirit level. I look at it on body level, and then I look at it on environment level. They all matter, right? They can all be a factor. There could be a biochemical genetic predisposition that, you came in with this card and you have to do a little more to overcome it. That's a factor. Um, the body could get very injured through different ways of childhood and different things, and you've got metabolic issues and you've got gut issues and other hormonal issues, and so all that, and inflammation, and so that's a very big factor, right? Very practical biological factors. But then we have the mind and the spirit, right? Which is your question. And I believe that everyone does have inherent an inherent north star inside of them that drives them, if they listen to it, that it brings them the most meaning and fulfillment in their life. And that can be such a wide spectrum of what that is. If you don't listen to it, I believe that it is, you feel like you're swimming upstream. If you have obstacles in your life that make it very hard to fulfill it, like you're in jail and it's like you have this mission to do something that, you're in jail, you have to work in a different way to still stay fulfilled when that purpose can't actualize in the form that you were hoping for. But I believe that, yeah, we all have a North Star. If we don't listen enough to know what it is and follow it, we're going to get sick. And you could call that a spiritual illness. I think that's fair, but it will absolutely can show up as depression for sure, agitation, anxiety, any of these things. So it's a fact. It's a huge factor. It's like the central internal sort of core direction of your being in life. So if you don't know that direction, it's going to disturb you for sure.
Yeah, and I guess like most young people, in university, etc., we're not following our north star. I mean, how would you even know how to find it? After graduating, you got a nice fancy job offer, and you were on the subway ready to take it. And maybe we could tell that story.
Well, that's a cool moment in my life. I was 21. Um, what happened was the summer before I graduated college, I was working for Bear Stearns, which went down in 2008. They were the top 3 brokerage firm at the time. I was doing an internship. And I happened to have a really cool internship, and the Y2K thing was going on. It was 1997, so it wasn't yet there. But they were starting to gear up and they were switching their entire computer system to a new one that tracks all their brokerage accounts. And anyways, the long story short is I found like $10 million or something discrepancy between the two systems, and I figured out where it was, and it was a rounding error, and they were rounding in a way that they didn't need to round. There was no rule about it, and so they were sort of rounding down instead of rounding up or something. And so there was this like $10 million where there was this stupid rounding error. So they loved that. So then the next, when I was the subway, is that they were like, we want you to spearhead our Y2K project. There's 10 of the largest brokerage firms in the world. I'm going to have a senior liaison for each firm. And we're going to figure this all out together to make sure the world doesn't end. The financial markets don't crash all around the world and we're screwed. So they wanted to contract me for 3 years to see that to completion for them. So I was in a very deep existential crisis of, is this me? That whole summer I was, pulling my hair out. Is this me? This is sort of what I did. I was a business major and I'm like, but this isn't me. I don't know what I am, but I don't think I'm this, but maybe I should do it, on and on. And I decided I'm doing it. And so I told them I'm coming to work on the first day. I'll sign the contract. And I was going to work, and I thought I was doing it. And then I got into the subway station under the World Trade Center, and I I just collapsed and had this huge wave move through me of, this is fucking not me. What am I doing? This actually isn't me. I know there's something else that's my North Star essentially, but it's not this. And it was very hard and, crushing. I had to call them. I called them from a phone booth over there before cell phone days, and I was shaking. And I was being contracted by one of the senior people at this top brokerage firm in the world. I was going to be in their senior management where the CEO was. That's where my office was going to be. And I was like, I can't do this. And he, I was just shaking. And he's like, what are you talking about? We've been waiting for you. And so I was like, I'm not doing it. And then, from there, I had to call my parents and tell them, and it was a fucking nightmare. But it was all good. But then I was like, I'm going to figure out what I'm supposed to do. I know it's not this now. So then in that moment, I made a decision. I'm only living by my North Star. Like, I'm only going to live by what I'm supposed to do. I don't care what the consequences. I left with no money in the bank. I drove up to Vermont, and I'm like, I got nothing, but I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah, so what was that North Star? I know up in Vermont, there was some nature involved. You started to get involved with the, yoga and meditation and stuff in your 20s. Yeah, let's talk about your 20s and the continuation of the story after that moment in the subway.
Well, I quickly became extremely spiritually minded. As soon as that happened, it was a very interesting moment. And I didn't know, that's when the discovery process started. I didn't know what my mission and higher values were. I just didn't know, but I knew it was something around healing. I started to know that. So what naturally first arose is I needed help. I needed some healing, and psychiatry wasn't cutting it. And I turned to spirituality. I turned to yoga, the yoga tradition. And I met my first teacher. As soon as I was like, it's yoga. I know it's yoga. There was no yoga around 30 years ago where I was. I mean, there was pockets in big cities, but it was pockets. Like, it wasn't around. It wasn't mainstream. The internet was fledgling. It's still phone book days. So I didn't know what to do. So I just was like, I know I need to learn yoga. And as soon as I said that to myself, within a month, I was living in this crazy house on this mountain, and I had to leave. I was working at a ski resort. I had to leave and move closer. And this guy moves in, and he's like, why don't you come? He was this really interesting dude. And as I was walking out the door, he was walking in, basically. He's like, hey, are you interested in yoga? I was like, yeah. He's like, I teach yoga. So I started learning yoga with him. I kept going back to this crazy house. And then it turned out he was the very close student of my first teacher, Yoga Yamar Desai. And he started coming to the house teaching me yoga. He was the founder of Kripalu Yoga, who was one of the first yogis to bring yoga to the West. And that's how and then that unfolded for years.
Did it help or?
Oh yeah, it helped. But yeah, it shifted some things. I also like to talk about spiritual practices. So it's very interesting. The somatic based practices, which yoga obviously is a strongly somatic based practice, contemplative practices. They naturally inherently are trauma tools, because whenever we're bringing presence to sensation as a practice, that's inherently trauma psychotherapy. So there's trauma tools embedded in the yoga system, as an ancient technology, which is pretty cool. And we could talk more about how that works, but it's another conversation. But so, yeah, it started helping. But the thing is, when you have a significant mental health condition, just doing an individual practice like that, what you can end up doing in the practice is starting to dissociate and disconnect from the body also. And it's a delicate and subtle thing. Any practice is, has both a blessing and a curse to it, right? So it's like you're always trying to grow and learn. So a lot of people in spiritual practices use them. There's some healing, there's some integration, but they also use them to check out of their feeling body. And I started using it to check out of my feeling body. Because as soon as I started realizing that, I was like, oh my God, they're all still here. um, there's all these old feelings are still here. They're not integrated. I've been avoiding some of them through these practices. So they have inherent things in there, but the reason why psychotherapy is useful too and other practices is because generally not enough to just do spiritual practices to heal a lot of trauma. I mean, or else there'd be, everybody under the sun that did it would just be like, I'm done, I'm great. But it's not really what happens typically. Um, you see people going and doing meditation retreats, or they go on silent meditation, and sometimes they come out way more traumatized than they did before because they're really disconnecting. So there's a delicate interplay there. There's a lot of great benefit that can be had from these spiritual ancient tools, and there's also, it's just like any other tool. You could use it and not realize you're actually bypassing the very thing you need to integrate.
And integration and combining many different things together, tools, whatever you want to call them, technologies, is a core part of your mindset and your work. So if you were to add something in at that time, or I guess you did start adding things in, or maybe you left yoga, I don't know. What do you add in? What do you start to integrate into it?
Well, my journey went from a number of stages, as most people's do. Like, so I started in the psychiatric space for my own healing. I went into the yoga tradition as my next stage. Then I became a professional psychotherapist as my next stage. Which, if you become a healer, you're also studying healing for yourself. I mean, that's what healers do. Um, so that was a stage, right? I'm helping people, but I'm also learning about healing in that process. You're trying things out on people that you're trying on yourself. I mean, that's what healers do. So that was a stage, and then it kept evolving. I returned to psychedelic church, an ayahuasca church in my 30s. That was a stage. Then I returned to psychiatry, my late 30s, early 40s, for myself, for integrative lens, which is now what we do and teach, but where I really started to work on healing my body and all the systems that are injured from, all that stress, traumatic stress. So, and not eating the way I needed to be eating and all that. So, and I had to do a lot of healing on my injuries there. And of course, I've done my own trauma therapy, and this, that, and the other stuff. I've been around the block for sure, many stages, many different things. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about some of these psychedelics. Hearing your story, I was a bit not surprised, but it seemed like you were maybe reacting in ways that, I mean, you can't say there's a normal reaction, but I mean, psilocybin is known for bringing presence and calm and a sense of connection, etc. You know a lot more about it than me. I've never tried LSD, I don't know, but you had this very anxiety provoking thing. But then again, you also said it's very tied to trauma, so maybe just I don't know, something's woken up. So let's start with psilocybin. What does psilocybin do to the brain, and why do you think you reacted in the way that you did?
Well, psilocybin is studied primarily for treatment resistant depression right now, end of life anxiety, lesser studies, but that's there. People who are stuck in depression for a while. Um, in 1 to 2 sessions, resetting something and helping them pop out. So that's generally what the studies are. I mean, there's others, but like the FDA trials, the phase 3 trials that are going on, which take a long time to get to. So those are the big studies. There's lots of little studies on all kinds of other stuff. But so with that said, first of all, I wasn't that person, right? So I wasn't just like a deeply stuck, depressed guy. So that's one thing to just say. Psilocybin does different things. One thing it seems to be really good at is kind of shutting down this network in our brain, the default mode network, which is largely responsible for our concept of self and the sort of container of self, and how I start and end somewhere. And sort of how we walk through the day, and it sort of shuts that down. We could have an ego. It doesn't always, but it depends how much you're taking, everything. But it can shut that down. The ego can fall away. But then what's interesting is different ways the brain starts communicating to each other when that happens somehow, in ways that it wasn't before during that experience. And then, of course, there's like the neuroplasticity, or dendritic sprouting and new connectivity. On a more psychological level, a lot of things can happen. Seeing your own life in a new way, revisiting memories, having mystical experiences, all this stuff. It's a very wide range. With all of that said, psychedelics in general, not just psilocybin, have a funny way of amplifying trauma in our nervous system. So trauma can get amplified. The way the expression of trauma in our life that we feel either every day, or maybe it doesn't happen every day and it comes more in waves, it can often amplify that in a strong way. And sometimes it amplifies it in a way where you can process it, fully in that moment. And if it's done as a psychedelic therapy session, you have a much better chance of that than doing it recreationally like I did, where my trauma got amplified. I have no idea what it was. Most people don't when it happens, especially outside of psychedelic therapy. And they just feel flooded and crazy and overwhelmed and extremely uncomfortable. And a lot of times it's just trauma that's flooding your system. So, generally speaking, a lot of these psychedelics will amplify trauma and give you an opportunity to actually new angle to come in and do some resolution work there. But they all work differently. I mean, MDMA is a very specifically for trauma and the PTSD symptoms, and it's a softer psychedelic, so it's generally a lot easier to process that amplification of trauma. Psilocybin's more classical psychedelic, and it works on the serotonin receptors, and you could have visuals and perceptual changes and all this stuff. And but also like you can have all this mystical experience and ego dissolution stuff. All stays sort of similar to that. It's being researched for anxiety actually, and they're far along in that study. Ketamine is its own thing. It's dissociative. You could have sort of an out of body experience. It's good with depression also, but also, and that works a little differently, but it also can allow you to sort of be looking at trauma from a distance. So depends on the medicine and all of that. But one thing that seems consistent with psychedelics is they can uproot trauma.
Ketamine really helped you, right? That was like a big one.
I had a ketamine therapy treatment. I haven't done many psychedelics in 10 years. Most of my psychedelic use was prior to 10 years ago because I'm very sensitive to them. But I was in an ayahuasca church 15 years ago, and then some psychedelic use in my 20s. But I had a ketamine therapy session that was super powerful for me. It was one of the first psychedelic experiences where I really in the session had major resolution. Generally for me, psychedelic experiences was uprooting trauma, but not resolving, but having it flood that I could actually see it and feel it more strongly, which is sort of diagnostic in a sense. But no, that session was very healing. I had a more of a resolution in that session.
And I guess part of that was you weren't just doing it recreationally or at the church or whatever. You had this psychiatry component combined with it. Of course, now you have this Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which is no coincidence. Maybe you could talk about the importance of combining these two together, psychiatry, psychotherapy, and psychedelics, and maybe the risks or the limitations of just doing one on their own.
There's different reasons, right, for everything. So there's kind of multiple settings of psychedelics. There's recreational use. There's get together with friends. We're going to try and hold space with each other use. Then there's like full on ceremonial use. And then there's psychedelic therapy use, right? And so, I mean, I'm not a fan personally for myself of recreational use. They're not good for me in that way. But whatever, I don't have a problem with people doing that.
Yeah, some people they enjoy it and they're fine and it helps them. Yeah,
They enjoy it or whatever. It's like whatever. I don't need to judge that. Of course, it could be very useful for them. Ceremonial use has its own, context. It's depends on who's doing it, but it could be held from a lineage that's old and it's more of a spiritual container, I would say, not as much a mental health container. It's more of a spiritualized container. And you're doing sort of spiritual work there. you could be doing some mental health work, but you can also get yourself into trouble there if you have significant mental health conditions and they're not trained in that. That's the downside to that environment. If they're typically not trained in that kind of lens. And so sometimes you might get someone who's over spiritualizing a mental health condition that needs something else in order to get further and resolve it. And then there's psychedelic therapy, which, you've got a therapist and there's, a safe container. You're usually in a room somewhere, but it's like, we're going to do therapy here. And so that's, right now, basically that's ketamine legally because there's not too many other options. There are a couple other states and things with psilocybin, but generally speaking, that's ketamine therapy through a prescription. And it can be very powerful for people, for sure. I mean, it's why I've committed my career right now to helping move it forward because I think it's a really important tool for what we're facing right now on the planet. I mean, there will be better tools later, but we don't have them. And I think this is a good tool that we need to safely get into more people's hands.
And you said ketamine's quite different from these other psychedelics. How is it different, and why do you think it is so helpful for these people with I think depression is what you said?
Well, what's interesting about ketamine is that almost all of the research on ketamine for depression has nothing to do with therapy. So that's interesting just to note. And meaning that there's not even a therapist in the room with you in a lot of the small studies that have been done, or the larger study that's been done with a drug company released a new molecular version of ketamine called Spravato a handful of years ago, so that they could patent it. But this wasn't a therapy environment. It still seems to help a lot. So there's biological properties at play, but we can't separate. Okay, there's biological properties at play. That's clear. We also can't separate that something's happening psychologically in those sessions. So I don't know what's weighted toward what, like what's actually causing the change. Like, are they even different? I don't know. But I will say that the downside of doing ketamine therapy without a therapist is you could get scared and overwhelmed and feel traumatized actually after your session. And maybe it reduced your depression symptoms a little, but now you're sort of feeling all jacked up from feeling a little traumatized. So I think it's always better to have a therapist with ketamine therapy if you can than going to like a ketamine IV clinic that doesn't have a therapist there. You're dealing with a psychedelic and it's different. It's a dissociative. So you feel you could, in its strongest form, be completely disconnected to your body. Strongest form, you don't even exist. Like you go away. That's how strong dissociation gets. If you have enough of it in a surgical setting, you don't even remember. That's what it's been used for this whole time. This is only since it's been around since 1970 as a surgical aid or a pain aid, as an anesthetic. But in the early 2000s, we discovered in lower doses, you don't completely go away. You can still stay online, but in lower doses, it actually treats depression, not in higher doses. It's very interesting, which is also interesting, right? It's like, why is such a great effect in lower doses?
And it's also interesting that you said you were quite dissociated in your youth, and then yet this dissociative kind of drug helped you. So it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but maybe not. So what do you think is a connection between your dissociation and then ketamine somehow being one of the more helpful psychedelics for you?
So it's a very nuanced question you're asking. So when we talk about dissociation from trauma, or the more extreme versions of dissociation, which are dissociative disorders, which are like depersonalization, derationalization. You don't feel like yourself. You don't feel like the world is real, in the more extreme versions. And that can keep going. Dissociative identity disorder, multiple personalities. And that is not the same thing as the class of drug dissociative. Um, there's a relationship though, but it's not the exact same thing. Like there's a relationship. You are causing a dissociation That is true. But it's not typically the same when it's happening, it's not typically those patterns of dissociation that's happening. It's a stronger, broader disconnection from the ego than those types of, but now with that said, those things can happen. And people that have dissociative disorders like that, ketamine could aggravate them and not be a good fit. I happened to have had an amazing session, but it did end with dissociative issues at the very end of the session. They settled down within a few days for me, and I'm very used to that historically, but that's why I can't do these things very often. But this is a much smaller group of people that struggle with those types of dissociative issues. Most people have dissociation on a spectrum from trauma that aren't manifesting as those issues, just like you have trauma on a spectrum that aren't manifesting as PTSD symptoms. It's the same thing. You have dissociation on a spectrum that aren't manifesting as dissociative disorders. So that makes sense. It's nuanced. It's a lot there.
I asked a very specific question that might only apply to a very small subset of people like you. So maybe it's not the
Yeah,
most
like
useful
me.
question.
No, it's fine. It's a very important distinction, and people suffer from these things, but everyone suffers from some level of presence. They have an issue with presence. Sorry, they suffer from a dissociation from presence. Like that's the entire spiritual traditions are about getting more present. So like we all have issues with dissociation and disconnection. But it's not necessarily a illness per se. It's more like a function.
What is the connection between presence and what we're calling mental illness, and how are these psychedelics playing a role in all of that?
Well, I believe the connection between presence and trauma is that trauma is is a disorder of presence, I believe. So when you become present to the places in your body that are activated from an old event, presence uncouples the old memory from that activation point in your body because now you're present to current sensation. And so you sort of stop reliving old sensations. So presence is probably the most essential tool to healing trauma. Now, how you get to presence around trauma is a different thing. There's a lot of sources that can get you there. Psychedelics can do that, but they don't always do that. But they can evoke a presence inside of you to heal something. So I do believe that presence is one of the primary conditions of healing trauma.
And there might be some intuitive, semi common sense answers to this, but how else will we get back to that presence?
Well, that's the many paths to one goal. I mean, there's so many paths. There's the whole thing. My whole journey is, all those paths is all those paths, is whether it's psychiatry or therapy or yoga or spirituality or, there's so many paths to cultivating presence in our lives. And all of these paths have the same caution, which is you could end up using them to get less present and you don't even know it. And that's the whole spiritual journey in a nutshell, which is, are you opening to more presence, or are you actually closing the aperture down and closing off the presence? And the practice reveals that over time when you're very committed to wanting to see what's happening. But it's very easy to close off the presence and just open up to cool states. States aren't necessarily presence, they're states. I mean, presence might be something else. Presence is not different states of the mind that is attainable. It's something else.
Earlier, you said that the younger generation is suffering more with mental health, and I guess it's not just them. What do you think is causing this, and what's your prediction for the future?
Well, it's not just them, but the curve of mental health issues among youth is going way faster than adults in terms of the increase in mental health disorders that are recognizable. So that curve has become exponentially in the last 20 years. So we have to look at the last 20 years to answer the question. And I think it's pretty obvious to me. I mean, I would say that social media is a massive factor. Technology and gaming was a factor. We are raising children on way more dopamine seeking, reward based systems than ever before. They don't have to tolerate as much. They don't have to get frustrated as much to earn a reward. They don't have to get bored and impatient as much. And so, you're sort of entraining an addict's mind in children. That's one major problem. Another problem is we're disconnecting socially because of all this. And the social engagement nervous system feels it. That you don't get the same mirror neuron response online that you're going to have in person. And that's a major factor. I think we have another sort of confluence of things with COVID and the isolation there. And then, of course, a confluence of things with just absolute political upheaval and turmoil in many countries around the world, and including the United States. And a lot of polarization. We're in a wave of intense polarization again. Those come in waves, and that's very disturbing for young people and old people and older people. But it's disturbing for youth to grow up in that, and a lot of confusing new experiences of identity emerging. And there's a lot there that children are facing that they just are not well set up for, and so they are struggling, and it is really scary. I think. Where are we headed? I mean, I think if we look at history, generally speaking, an upheaval tends to eventually lead to something new and evolves, and the planet evolves over time. So I would say we're going to evolve through whatever we're in right now. I'm confident of that. But with that said, you also have to keep a very new factor into the conversation, which is AI. And how is that going? How are we going to evolve alongside of AI? That is a major factor in the next 100 years. And it's a major factor around our mental health. And we don't know, because AI will outpace our evolution soon in terms of our own intellectual capability. So we don't know what's coming, and it's coming very soon. And we are not set up for it. And so we don't know. I don't know. It could be that one outcome is we make discoveries and we start solving these problems of, regulation in our brain and nervous systems and thought patterns. And we really create some very cutting edge ways to evolve as a species through this sort of, limbic system stuff that gets a hold of us, and reptilian behavior and dysregulation and trauma. Like, I think that's probably what's going to happen. We will integrate technology to solve these problems probably within the next 50 to 70 years is my guess. And will be very different soon, I think. I don't know how far it is. It could be 50 years, it could be 150, it could be 250, but it's not 1,000 or 2,000 years. Like, we will evolve soon. And if you listen to any AI person talk of, they're saying the same thing. Like, we're going to evolve soon. So we will, but the question is, how bad is it going to get before that happens? That's the question. Because it's pretty gnarly right now, but it's gnarly, but it could get worse, and it could get a lot worse. So we don't know. I'm hopeful.
Yeah. And you want to feel like there's something you can do individually, but it sounds like also what you're saying is it's such an overall big, massive societal humanity, economic changes. The big background of our lives are going to change so much. We're going to change that. Maybe I don't know what my question was going to be. What can we individually do to kind of reduce the risk of us, falling apart in this whole process? But maybe AI is just bigger than an individual.
You can. No, you can. Well, that's a different issue, but you can do something individually. Because even though there are future technologies that will make this simpler for ourselves, we happen to be born with technology and we have created technology over time as humans that can solve it now. So, what you need to do is completely commit to a life of your North Star, your mission, your purpose, and healing yourself. That's what you need to do. If you do that, you will ride through this and you will be able to hold it in your whatever happens, you'll be able to hold in a way where you can digest it until you're dead. But and you can move toward that and you can live a fulfilling life no matter what's happening. But you have to take on the personal responsibility to go for it fully. And you know, that's hard. Most people don't want to do that. They don't take it on. They don't even know that they can. But so the more people that do that is how we get through the stage with AI. Because that is a serious situation. We are going to create something that's eventually smarter than us. So, what happens when that happens? Nobody knows. But if we are working toward integration as a species, the more people that take that on and wholeness, we will be more rational and more centered and more mindful about the choices and decisions we make along the way. And that's important. And we'll build, you know, lineages will be healthy. The people that take that on, there'll be more health in certain lineages, and that matters.
Yeah, and you have a really great 3 or 4-part series on finding your values and finding your North Star, which I recommend people listening to. I don't know if you remember what you were talking about on there, but one part I definitely liked was you gave us like 4 or 5 questions to help us find that. Can you recall some of those questions, or maybe you can create some new ones on the spot right now?
I'll probably have to create some new ones, but they'll probably be related. If you want, this is really a question about knowing what your values are. The person who introduced me to this is Dr. John DeMartini. He's a values expert. He's spent his career studying behavior and values. But if you want to know what your values are, it's not that hard. So the first thing you have to do is sort of scrape off the addictive behaviors, because those it's more complicated to figure out in those behaviors what your values are. You can, but like the robotic addictive stuff, like, well, you know, what do you do with your time is one question. But it's like, well, I'm on my phone 8 hours a day looking at Instagram. It's like that's a difficult place to really find your values. You can, but it's like, what do you do with your time that inspires you? What do you do with money that inspires you? Who do you go listen to learn from that inspires you when you're wanting to learn? What are they talking about? What type of friends around you, what do you have in common that you really share values around? These are your values, and you can find them in your life, in your everyday behavior. And the more you align your behaviors with those values through the day, there's time and place for addictive behaviors, but the more you align and gain control over your behavior, aligning them with those values, the more you're going to be feeling your own worth. Because what you value is your worth in the world. So that's what self worth is. So the more you can align those behaviors with that which you value, the more you will experience the worth you have to offer the world, and the more you'll be fulfilled. And it's very straightforward. It's a little harder to do. And then as you start doing it more and more, it becomes a lot easier. A lot easier. I mean, I keep refining this year over year, and you know, the amount of efficiency and behaviors that go toward my what really is important to me now is astronomically more than when I was 20 in a day. So, you know, once you understand the principle and you start working at it and you stack that day over day over day, you're also going to find yourself manifesting a lot in this world that's aligned with who you are.
Yeah. I guess the challenge is one is, yeah, defining and finding those values, but these questions you gave us help a lot. And there are other ways to do it. If we, sit with some paper and close our eyes and think about things. But then the other challenge is, implementing it. And as you mentioned, like, habit change is not easy, but Yeah, any tips on how to get through that beginning period of it feeling really weird?
Habit change, not simple. If you're not dealing with a significant mental health condition that's really messing with your habit change ability, so let's put that aside for the moment because that requires, you need care, you need help to settle that fire down a little bit. Let's assume you've done that. Well, first of all, let's say you know what your values are. It's a practice each day. It's like when you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you're going to do? That's going to give you one step toward what's important to you. It might be learning something. It might be drinking a glass of water to feel the energy to go make the next step, whatever it is. But it's a theme through the day that you return to mentally. What's the highest priority task I can do to get me closer to what's important to me throughout the day, wherever you are, whatever you're doing? It doesn't matter where you're working. I've in my early 20s, I worked a lot of different types of jobs that, back then I couldn't tell you how they were related to my values, but here I am. So apparently they were, or I wouldn't be here, right? So you have to look for the links that how is this and getting me closer, and what else can I do today to get me one step closer? And what about my attitude? How can I shift my attitude to recognize I'm already on the way to what's important to me? Because the more you see in your life the results of your own values, the more they will appear to you, the results of your own values.
Back then, you were labeled with all these different diagnoses, bipolar 2 and OCD and this and that, and then you were having some experiences of what people with these, mental, disorders or whatever you wanna call them have, but now you seem all better, but I guess we're never all better, but, what happened and what can we learn from your experience to help people like that or, maybe they're not that far on the spectrum, but, they're suffering.
I mean, there's spectrums here, right? I mean, people that are severely mentally ill living in the streets, you hope there's a system around them to help them along, But the question really comes down to what ignites inside of someone the will to heal. And actually, it's so strong that they can't shut it off and that they have to follow it. That's really what it comes down to. So, unfortunately, sometimes that's severe pain that ignites that. And some people, it's psychedelic journey that ignites it, not even just from pain, like something about it. And some people, it's you meet a teacher all of a sudden and boom, it's like pops. They say something to you, and or it's just like you wake up. But I think when you're curious enough that you're listening to a podcast like this, right, or you're looking for information, something inside of you is screaming to take this all the way home. And it's like if you can listen to that inside yourself, this isn't just for people that are severely mentally ill. I mean, we all want to achieve great things in the world. We all want to be deeply fulfilled. We want items in our life. We want all kinds of shit, right? So if you're able to listen deeply, the call's in everyone. The call to fully become yourself and be whole is inside of everyone. You just got to listen. And if you're listening, it's right there. And as soon as you start listening more and more, it just starts waking up so big you'll never be able to shut it off again. That's how it works. Once that happens, you're done. You're going. And you know, you're gonna either heal or more and more, or you're gonna die trying, but you're going once you let it just rip through you. It's in everyone to both heal and to serve in a powerful way. And that again, it does every form is possible. It's not about like the success meter and any of that.
Sort of side tangent, but I am curious. I also studied philosophy. Well, that was my major, and that was like the meaning of my life for a good 5 years. That's all I cared about and all I thought about. So I'm curious what philosophers were a big impact on you back then, and maybe how they're still with you now, or maybe you've gotten disgusted by them now. And now you like these other philosophers, or your philosophical ideas have been changing. This is a big question to throw in at the hour mark, but I'm just too curious.
Well, the biggest was a modern philosopher who had the biggest impact. It was Ken Wilber, which is integral philosophy. Had the biggest impact. You know, he's extremely psychologically oriented, and he's a synthesizer. So he's taking philosophy and lots of disciplines in order to create a working model of how we are in the world and our own experience. And so I would say he had the largest impact on me by far, but it also aligned really well with the traditions of psychotherapy I studied. And but I took to integral philosophy, and that had an impact on me. I didn't go very deep into it. I didn't go very deep into philosophy in general. I dabbled with philosophers. Currently, I'm sort of geeking out on astrophysics and things. That's really interesting to me. If you know, it's like the more we pursue understanding reality, I think that in and of itself is a healing journey because we can get outside of our own little bubble as we start to just try and understand what we know about reality at this point. So right now I'm just sort of kind of getting interested in sort of how the laws of physics works on cosmic scale, not like crazy deep. I mean, I'm not, doing math equations, but yeah.
Yeah. But digging into these various disciplines, or tools, for example, for the mental health journey and kind of combining them together and taking this and that from there and not just relying on I'm just an astrophysicist or I'm just a mathematician or I'm just a philosopher, but combining them together and just in the same way that you got psychedelics here. And then we didn't talk about the metabolic health stuff and nutrition, but that's a piece. There's social connections, all these things, and bringing them all together seems to be like a basic principle behind how you're living. And then you founded the Integrative Psychiatry Institute together with this guy Will, and then yeah, what made him a good partner for this? And maybe talk just a little bit about what the institute is for people who are not aware. It is the biggest place to train psychiatrists with psychedelic therapy. But I'll let you get into it, and yeah, also the question of why Will and what's great about him.
Well, he's a close friend. We've been friends for, I don't know, 16, 17 years now. He's a psychiatrist. He's an integrative psychiatrist, and I'm a psychotherapist. And we both sort of had at the same moment in time a awakening inside of us of we want to we want to educate providers. We feel like the more providers you educate, way more people you can reach to get healthy, meaningful interventions to versus just one-on-one care. So we just sort of had an inspiration at the same moment in time. And so, he was practicing this stuff in his practice, and I was practicing some on the psychotherapy end of the spectrum. He was practicing the medical pieces. So that's how it came about. And that was 7 years ago, about a little over 7 years ago.
And then you stopped doing psychedelics. You said you haven't really done anything for a decade. Is it just like they did their job, you don't need them anymore, or what's the logic behind that?
I'm just, unique in some ways. And I think they're disruptors. Psychedelics are disruptors. And I don't need a lot of disruption. My brain is sort of a disruptor in general. Like it's very, I think very fast, and my brain is, I'm waking up in the middle of the night with ideas, whether it's for the company or whatever. It's just like my brain is sort of on high octane. So psychedelics is a lot for me. I'm already having, crazy dreams and all this. So it's just not. And also like I'm like for me, I see psychedelics as a intervention. Like you want to move something. It's like it's not that I would never do them again. I mean, if there might be a time where it's like I need an intervention. And I've done them a few times in a decade. But I think they're strong tools. They're not to be taken lightly. And yeah, so that's why. But I'm also unique.
What are some like softer tools that can kind of we don't want to overuse the word psychedelic, but I mean they're sort of psychedelic in a way that aren't quite ayahuasca can be like a far on the spectrum over here. Then you got the actual psychedelics, you got MDMA, but then you got things like I don't know breath or sex or nature. Or, I don't know. It could be whatever.
All of that. All of that. I mean, first of all, you could have a psychedelic experience other ways. I mean, You could have a very disruptive experience in your life in other ways that you didn't ask for, but here they are, divorce or death, and that can be a big disruptor. And then you can actually, catalyze from there. But nature is a massive thing. I just went to Alaska a few weeks ago for the first time, and that was as powerful for me as most of my psychedelic experiences. Just it's huge nature there. If you haven't been there, it's hard to describe, and things like that can have massive impacts on people. So I think there's lots of ways to not just grow but also if you need a disruption, there are other ways to do it. Psychedelics are definitely not the only way. You could go on a 10-day meditation retreat. That'll kick your ass. If you've never done that before, you got to be prepared for that because that could really kick your ass.
I'm about to do my first one this December, so Merry Christmas to
Okay.
me.
There you go. There you
We'll
go.
see. We'll see. Maybe guide people on where to go if they want more of this.
Yeah. So psychiatryinstitute.com. That's the IPI's website. There's a lot of resources on there. Higher Practice podcast is cool. There's a lot of interesting episodes in there to check out. And we have a psychedelic therapy book coming out in March, and that will be everywhere. It's published through a house, so highly accessible. And so there's that coming too, and that's going to be a cool book. It's a really cool book.
Oh, last question. You started asking people this question on your podcast, your billboard. If you had a billboard, they could say anything that everyone's going to read. What would it say?
Well, what would it say today? Strap yourself in. Things are going. It's an intense ride right now, but at the same time, if you can take in the ride, it's a fucking amazing moment to be alive. So if you could take it in, it's an amazing moment. And gratitude is your best friend. If you can allow gratitude to arise, you're halfway there.